Mr. Gething, I've a handful of further questions from you that core participants have asked to have raised. I've asked you this morning about the exclusion from the scheme of bereaved parents, non-dependent children, other family members. What about the position of carers who may have themselves lost income or pensions, who may have suffered their own health difficulties and indeed continue to suffer that loss, or if still caring for their infected partners? Do you agree that there is a moral case for the provision of financial support to that category of individual?
Well, I can understand the moral case that is made, and I'm not unsympathetic to it. The challenge is that we have a current set of support schemes that are drawn up in a specific way, and it's really about how, if the compensation schemes are to be real, how you then understand those people that have been directly impacted by the need to provide care and support, as well as those people who have suffered financial loss, as well as those people who have been bereaved. So, yes, I recognise the point that is being made.
And you set out your understanding that some of the ongoing discussions between officials incorporated consideration of the position of the, wider family members, including the position of those who are bereaved, who are not widows or partners, etc. Have the discussions, to your knowledge, addressed at all the question of carers in the position that I've described?
I'm not aware of all the detail of those discussions, but I would expect that they would be part of discussions about not just the parity in the schemes moving forward, but also the unfinished, the recently started conversation where there is going to be a proper compensation scheme.
Now, I've asked you this morning about the funding stream in relation to HIV payments, and you've told us, as indeed Dr. Jones did in his statement, about funding received from the Department of Health and Social Care. In terms of the bereavement payments that have hitherto been made in Wales on the 3-year basis, where those are bereavement payments made to widows or partners of those who had been infected with HIV, who has up till now funded those payments? Is it the Department of Health and Social Care, or has that come from the Welsh budget?
But my understanding is that for those people, those are still payments made through the scheme, so that's devolved. That's all part of the schemes that we are handling. And the money that is transferred each year, the Welsh Government, Scottish, Northern Irish Government and Executive respectively then have to decide how to use that money in the schemes that we provide.
But in terms of the calculation made by the Department of Health and Social Care as to what it will give on an annual basis to the Welsh Government for the HIV funding, do you know if that's calculated by reference to what's made available in England, which wouldn't have included these bereaved payments, or is it a sum that is intended to cover and does cover all HIV-related payments made by WIBs?
My understanding is it relates to the share, as it were, of HIV people, but I'd want to check that to make sure I'm not giving you a misleading answer.
There are a number of points, Mr. Gething, in relation to all of the evidence that we've heard this week where we may be asking some further points of clarification, in particular in relation to the detailed implications of the new parity arrangements. And if there is anything you've been unable to answer or can further clarify, then there will be a means for that to happen. In terms of HIV payments going forward, have the parity discussions included any discussion about whether the existing Department of Health and Social Care funding stream will continue?
Yeah, that is part of the necessary parity discussions moving forward to make sure there's a proper underpinning for where we are. So you've seen in Dr. Jones's statement in my earlier evidence that we think it would be sensible for everyone to have a more predictable way to deliver payments. and that would include the long-term provision on HIV and other scheme payments as well. So the best way to do that, I think, is in having a long-term settlement that we've made a significant jump forward with on parity, but there is still more to do.
Now, you've told us that in terms of the practical arrangements for implementing the changes announced on the 25th of March, that might take some time. Your aspiration was that it would be this calendar year, by the end of this calendar year, or hopefully earlier. Whilst the Welsh Government was waiting for a decision from the UK Government on funding in relation to achieving parity, did the Welsh Government set up or asked WIBS to set up any systems or contingency plans to enable it to, as it were, hit the ground running? Or is that work only starting now?
Well, it's only really since the 11th of March to then the statement being made in the 2 weeks. There was quite a lot to do in those 2 weeks to get things up and running and agreed. So within that window, I don't think it'd be realistic to say that we've set up an alternative mechanism in case those parity discussions didn't land and come to fruition. And this is actually quite difficult. The challenge in coordinating all of the information we got from the Old Alliance House schemes took about 6 months with information being provided, and I think that's detailed and set out in other witness statements and evidence you've had. So it's trying to set a realistic time frame for when we can do that. But as I say, earlier if possible, and we'd certainly want to do this as early as possible for beneficiaries' sake.
Given the changes that are contemplated further to your announcement on the 25th of March 2021, so the amendments to the scheme to try and achieve greater parity, to what extent are discretionary payments or income top-up payments going to remain part of the Welsh scheme?
Well, that's part of what I understand is subject to the ongoing discussions on parity. And you have this challenge of income top-up payments and whether there's a means testing element to them, well, that's the right thing to do or not. You also have, and we run through this a little before, about discretionary payments, and any form of discretionary payment, there's a challenge about how fair it is and what the basis and parameter for that is. And are we going to have a discretionary fund, and if so, on what basis is going to be made available? I think it'd be helpful if there was as much agreement as possible on the scale of that and the knowledge that people have about their ability to apply for discretionary payments. And we'll need to regularly remind people about the facility if it's going to continue as well. Otherwise, we'll have the sort of the lopsided approach to discretionary payments, where some people never make use of it and others will, and there's likely to be unhappiness about it.
Now, the final group of questions I have for you, Mr. Gething, touch on matters relating to funding, which you've already to some extent addressed, but I just want to, I've been asked to seek clarification in a handful of respects. So is this right, that as things stand and have stood prior at least to the 25th of March 2021, if the Welsh Government wanted to increase hepatitis C or HIV payments, or indeed to widen the scope of the scheme and make payments to new categories of recipients, the Welsh Government would have to find the money from its overall health budget, which could not then be used for other health expenditure.
That's correct.
And so is it right to understand from your evidence that your preference would be for a system of funding in which funding for support was received directly from Her Majesty's Treasury, or in any event received in some way which didn't make it part of the health budget?
Yeah, you're always going to, in accounting terms, you're always going to need to have somewhere where that money is identified. But I think an identifiable stream of money on the basis of agreements on parity is eminently preferable. Otherwise, you will always have people saying, where is the money coming from? Is money being taken from the funding stream that should be there? And I think a level of opaqueness in this moving forward is not going to provide the settlement that all of us want to see.
So would it be right to understand two aspects of future funding that would be particularly important? One is that it's an identified pot of money, as it were, so that you don't get into the consequences that you've just described. And the second would be a degree of long-term commitment so that you can plan, but perhaps most importantly, you can give your beneficiaries the assurance, the guarantee, the security that they desire.
Yes, and that point about the security has been expressed in your previous questions as well. It came up in the consultation, people are able to make life choices and plans, and that would, I think, help all of us and be a good outcome to be able to achieve across the UK.
And then the final question, again, on the issue of funding arrangements was this. When the English schemes, regular payments were increased in 2019 from Department of Health and Social Care funding, why could Wales not mirror that by seeking a Barnett consequential to enable it to access an uplift in the funding available to WIBs?
Okay, so this is about how health funding is delivered across the UK. So almost all health funding is covered by Barnett. If there was additional money put into the health budget to cover that announcement on the first day of this inquiry, we would have had a Barnett share of that. But because the UK government said they'd found the money essentially down the back of the departmental sofa, then there was no consequential made at all. And they found the equivalent of £3 million in our budgetary terms within the departmental budget. And that was the statement that was made, and therefore there's no consequential provided to Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Mr. Gething, those are the questions I have for you. I'm just going to check whether your own representatives have any. No. Sir Brian.
I have no questions.
Okay. Mr. Gething, is there anything that you would like to add?
I just want to finish by saying that I am genuinely pleased that this inquiry is taking place. For all of the hurt and people having to relive their experiences in going through this, I really do hope that at the end of this we get a settlement that provides a measure of the justice that has been denied for a very long time. And I hope that the recommendations do lead to much greater equity across the UK, a measure of closure and a proper recognition of the genuine pain and upset that has been caused over a very long time. People are in a position today where they're suffering because the state got this wrong and let people down. And that failure has been lived with for a very long time. And I hope that future ministers won't be in a position where we're still having really difficult meetings with people who have been let down and recognise that they haven't been fairly treated since the final long and painful campaign to get recognition of that has been at least partially acknowledged. So I hope that the future after this inquiry will be a better one for all of the people who, as I say, have been let down in the past.
Thank you, sir.
Well, it remains for me to thank you for giving us your time this morning. I appreciate we've made you run close to the 1:20 deadline. But I'll just take a couple of minutes, if I may, to thank you for what I have seen as a thoughtful, eloquent, careful way in which you have given your evidence. But in particular, its humanity. And what struck me most of all, actually, was the measured way in which you expressed some of the frustrations, as it seemed to me, and I'm not inviting you to comment on this, at times it may have been that you were expressing having had some anger at both the delays and the unexpected surprises on the long route towards parity and what you see as justice for those who have been infected and affected. And I do respect the balanced way in which you've put that, so as not to be, perhaps, again, this is my take on it, so don't by any means comment, that you have avoided putting them in a way in which might have been unproductive. So I think I've heard it clearly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sir Brian.
So this afternoon's witness will be Mrs. Ramsey, who will be dealing with, in some more detailed respect, the workings of the Welsh scheme.
Well, we can manage her at 2 o'clock, can we not?
Yes, certainly.
So 2 o'clock. I hope that gives everyone enough time. I believe it should. If we slip by 5 minutes, then we do. But otherwise, it's 2 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.